Hello. Tonight, you step into the rain-soaked, mud-caked reality of the northern frontier, where the silence of the deep forest is broken only by the rustle of dead leaves and the distant, haunting memory of a lost army. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. The reception of the catastrophic intelligence within the imperial capital marked the definitive cessation of the era of unchecked expansionism that had characterized the preceding decades of the Principate. It was in the 9th year of the Common Era that the courier network, a marvel of logistical efficiency designed to shrink the temporal distance between the periphery and the center, delivered a report that dissolved the prevailing assumption of military invulnerability. The narrative of the disaster, carried over the Alps and down the paved arteries of the peninsula, detailed the total annihilation of 3 entire legions, along with their auxiliary cohorts and cavalry wings, in a region characterized by dense woodland and treacherous bogs. This event was not merely a tactical defeat but a systemic failure of the administrative and intelligence apparatus that supported the projection of power into the Barbaricum. The psychological impact upon the aging emperor was profound and immediate, manifesting in a period of mourning that dispensed with the usual decorum of the court. It is recorded in the annals that he allowed his hair and beard to grow untrimmed for months and was frequently heard shouting to the empty air, demanding the return of his lost legions from the deceased governor who had led them into the trap. The loss of the 3 golden eagles, the supreme standards of the legions, represented a theological rupture as much as a military one, signifying that the favor of the gods had been withdrawn from the enterprise of northern conquest. The administrative response to this trauma was a sudden and permanent shift in the grand strategy of the empire, transforming the great river that marked the boundary from a staging ground for forward operations into a hardened, defensive frontier. The illusion that the northern territories were on the verge of becoming a pacified province, complete with tax collectors, judicial courts, and urban centers, evaporated overnight. The surviving administrative records indicate a frantic effort to reorganize the provincial defenses, as the fear of a counter-invasion by the coalesced tribal confederations gripped the populace of the capital. The strategic reserve was mobilized, and the urban cohorts were placed on high alert, while the remaining legions on the Rhine frontier were ordered to dig in and fortify their positions rather than seek retribution in the open field. This transition from an offensive posture to a defensive crouch marked the physical acknowledgement that the legions were not invincible forces of nature, but human institutions subject to the laws of geography, weather, and deception. The silence that fell over the planning rooms of the Palatine Hill was the silence of a realization that the borders of the world were not infinite and that the capacity of the state to absorb manpower losses was finite. The retirement of the specific numerals of the lost legions from the military register served as a silent, enduring administrative memorial to the catastrophe, ensuring that no future cohort would ever bear those cursed designations again. The destruction of the army in the forest also necessitated a re-evaluation of the integration of auxiliary forces, upon whom the legions relied for specialized skills such as scouting and cavalry warfare. The betrayal by the tribal leader, who had been raised within the military structure, granted citizenship, and honored with equestrian rank, exposed a fatal flaw in the policy of assimilation. The assumption that exposure to the benefits of civilization would guarantee loyalty was proven false, replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of the native contingents that would color military policy for generations. The intelligence failure was absolute. The governor had been dining with the very man who was orchestrating his demise, dismissing reports of the conspiracy as the petty squabbles of tribal politics. This blindness was not a personal failing of one man but a cultural arrogance that pervaded the entire officer class, a belief that the mere presence of the standards was sufficient to cow a population into submission. The aftermath of the battle forced a painful restructuring of the diplomatic protocols used to engage with client states, moving away from trust and patronage toward a system of hostages, surveillance, and cynical manipulation. The myth of the Pax Romana, the peace imposed by superior force, was revealed to be a fragile construct, maintained only by the constant and visible application of violence, which had now failed spectacularly in the gloom of the northern woods. The economic repercussions of the defeat were equally severe. though less visible than the military panic. The loss of tens of thousands of able-bodied men, along with their arms, armor, and the immense baggage train that accompanied a consular army, represented a staggering destruction of state capital. The markets of the capital reacted with a contraction of credit and a spike in the cost of military supplies, as the state scrambled to equip new levies to plug the gap in the frontier. The proposed taxation of the new province, which was intended to offset the costs of the occupation and contribute to the imperial treasury, was replaced by the heavy burden of a permanent garrison state on the border. The dream of tapping into the mineral and human resources of the north was abandoned, and the empire was forced to accept that the cost of conquest in this region exceeded any potential return. The frontier became a sinkhole for funds, a bleeding wound in the budget that required constant cauterization with silver and iron. The realization settled in that the legions existed not to conquer the world, but to hold back the dark, preserving a sphere of order that was constantly under siege from the chaotic forces beyond the river. This containment policy, born of the trauma of the forest, would define the geopolitical shape of the continent for the next 4 centuries, a static line drawn in the mud that acknowledged the limits of imperial reach. 6 years after the initial catastrophe, the legions returned to the site of the disaster, not as conquerors seeking to re-establish administration, but as a punitive expedition force entering a graveyard to perform the final rites for the unburied dead. The field report from this expedition provides a grim, forensic accounting of the scene that awaited them, a landscape where the trauma of the past remained perfectly preserved by the isolation of the forest. The commander of this force, the nephew of the reigning emperor, led his troops through the narrow defile and the overgrown tracks, retracing the steps of the doomed column. As they advanced into the heart of the ambush zone, the topography itself revealed the mechanics of the slaughter. The earthen walls and barricades constructed by the tribesmen were still visible, overgrown with moss but clearly delineating the kill zones where the legions had been compressed and annihilated. The silence of the forest was heavy with the presence of the skeletal remains that carpeted the ground, the bleached bones of men and horses lying where they had fallen, some in piles indicating a last stand, others scattered singly where they had been cut down in flight. The psychological impact on the soldiers of the punitive expedition was profound, as they were not merely observing a historical site but walking among the remains of their former comrades and kinsmen. The chroniclers describe a scene of collective mourning mixed with a cold, professional observation of the tactical failure. They found the skulls of the centurions and tribunes nailed to the trunks of the trees, a ritualistic display of dominance by the victors. In the clearings, they discovered the altars where the senior officers had been sacrificed to the tribal gods, the ground still stained with the residue of the slaughter. The recovery of the physical remnants of the army, the broken weapons, the fragments of armor, the personal effects, served to humanize the scale of the loss. The troops spent days gathering the bones, unable to distinguish between the remains of the rank and file and the officers, and interred them in a massive collective tumulus. The raising of this burial mound was a labor of grief and closure, a physical attempt to bury the shame of the defeat along with the bodies of the defeated. It was a silent admission that the territory belonged to the dead and that the empire could visit, but could not stay. This revisitation of the battlefield solidified the understanding that the nature of warfare in this region was fundamentally different from the open field battles that the legions were designed to dominate. The environment of the dense forest, with its marshes, ravines, and lack of visibility, neutralized the advantages of formation, discipline, and engineering that were the hallmarks of the military machine. The trees broke up the lines, the mud bogged down the heavy infantry, and the foliage concealed the enemy until the moment of impact. The punitive campaigns conducted in the years following the return to the site achieved tactical victories and recovered 2 of the lost eagles, but they failed to alter the strategic equation. The tribes would melt away into the woods rather than stand and fight, engaging in a war of attrition that drained the resources of the expedition without offering a decisive engagement. The commander eventually withdrew his forces back across the river, not because he was defeated in battle, but because the cost of maintaining an army in such a hostile void was unsustainable. The decision to recall the expedition and grant the commander a triumph in the capital was a political maneuver to declare victory and disengage, a formal recognition that the vengeance had been satisfied, even if the conquest had been abandoned. The legacy of the return to the forest was a permanent alteration in the military doctrine regarding the northern frontier. The legions would no longer venture deep into the interior with the intention of annexation. Instead, the strategy shifted to a system of active defense, utilizing diplomacy, bribery, and occasional punitive raids to keep the tribal confederations destabilized and divided. The myth of invincibility, which relied on the inevitable expansion of the empire, was replaced by the reality of a hardened perimeter. The soldiers who stood guard on the watchtowers of the riverbank looked out across the water into a landscape that they now knew was capable of swallowing entire armies. The knowledge of what lay in the forest, the bones, the altars, the darkness, instilled a caution that curbed the aggressive instincts of the centurions. The empire had learned that there were places where its writ did not run, and where the organizational genius of the state was powerless against the chaotic fury of the indigenous population and the hostility of the natural world. This boundary became the psychological edge of the civilized world, a line beyond which lay a silence that commanded respect and fear. The internal stability of the military apparatus, which had been presumed absolute during the long reign of the first emperor, revealed its fragility in the immediate aftermath of the sovereign's death, a moment that coincided with the lingering psychological trauma of the northern defeat. It is recorded in the histories of the transition of power that the legions stationed along the Rhine frontier, the very forces tasked with guarding the boundary against the tribes that had annihilated their comrades, erupted into open mutiny upon receiving the news of the succession. This insurrection was not driven by a political desire to usurp the throne, but by a collective realization of their own wretched condition, a grievance that had been suppressed by the aura of the deceased ruler but which now boiled over in the vacuum of authority. The soldiers, garrisoned in the damp and mud of the borderlands, articulated complaints that stripped away the romantic veneer of imperial service. They spoke of service terms that stretched beyond the legal limit of 20 years, of meager pay deducted for clothing and food, and of a retirement that offered only marshy, uncultivable land on the fringes of the empire rather than the fertile Italian soil they had been promised. The myth of the legionary as a stoic, self-sacrificing servant of the state was shattered by the reality of a labor force that recognized its leverage over a new and untested administration. The discipline of the camp, the iron rod of the centurion, and the oath of allegiance were momentarily suspended, replaced by a chaotic democracy of anger where the rank and file dictated terms to the generals. The handling of this mutiny by the young commander, the nephew of the new emperor, serves as a case study in the management of institutional collapse through the redirection of violence. Confronted with thousands of armed men who refused to obey orders and who displayed the scars of their wounds as receipts for debt owed by the state, the commander was forced to resort to theatrical displays of loyalty and desperation, threatening suicide and distributing his own private funds to quell the uprising. The fragility of the imperial control was laid bare. The legions were revealed to be mercenaries in service to a dynasty only as long as the dynasty could guarantee their material survival. The resolution of the mutiny required the immediate manufacturing of an external crisis to reunify the fractured internal cohesion. The commander, understanding that idleness and reflection were the enemies of discipline, ordered a sudden and unprovoked invasion of the tribal lands across the river. This campaign was not motivated by strategic necessity or territorial acquisition, but by the psychological need to wash away the stain of sedition with the blood of the enemy. The legions, eager to redeem themselves and to secure plunder to supplement their grievances, crossed the frontier with a ferocity that was born of fear and guilt. The subsequent massacres of the unsuspecting tribal villages were not military engagements but acts of collective catharsis, a brutal reassertion of the power that the soldiers felt slipping from their grasp. The operational conduct of these post-mutiny campaigns revealed a shift in the tactical doctrine of the frontier armies, moving away from the confident, methodical expansionism of the earlier era toward a punitive, scorched earth methodology designed to inflict maximum demographic damage rather than to assimilate the population. The legions moved through the forests not as colonizers, but as destroyers, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and enslaving the inhabitants of the valleys. The silence of the forest was broken by the systematic destruction of the tribal infrastructure, a deliberate attempt to create a buffer zone of desolation that would insulate the empire from future threats. The reports sent back to the capital by the commander described these actions in the language of necessary pacification, but the subtext was one of anxiety. The empire could no longer afford to occupy this land, it could only afford to ruin it. The realization that the northern territories were a trap, a place where Roman order dissolved into chaos, had taken root in the military consciousness. The soldiers who marched through the mud and the freezing rain were not fighting for the glory of expansion, but for the stabilization of their own morale and the suppression of the memory of the disaster that had occurred in those same woods years prior. The political fallout of the mutiny in the capital was a deepening of the paranoia that characterized the new emperor's reign. The realization that the frontier legions, the ultimate guarantors of the imperial power, were capable of independent political action and negotiation created a permanent rift between the military and the civil administration. The emperor, a man of cautious and cynical disposition, viewed the popularity of the young commander and the volatility of the troops with deep suspicion. The myth of the unified state, where the army, the senate, and the princeps moved in harmony, was exposed as a fiction maintained only by the distribution of silver. The silence of the Senate House during the reading of the reports from the Rhine was a silence of apprehension, as the senators understood that the true power of the state lay not in their decrees, but in the mood of the camps on the edge of the world. The management of the empire became a balancing act of appeasing the soldiers while preventing them from realizing the full extent of their power, a dynamic that would plague the history of the state for the next 4 centuries. The loss of the northern legions in the forest had not only halted the expansion, it had destabilized the foundation of the imperial peace, turning the army into a dangerous beast that had to be constantly fed and distracted lest it turn upon its masters. The strategic recalibration that followed the mutiny involved the construction of a permanent, static barrier along the river, a physical admission that the era of fluid borders was over. The construction of the limes, a network of watchtowers, forts, and palisades, consumed the labor of the legions, transforming them from a field army into a border guard. The soldiers traded their marching packs for shovels and trowels, digging the ditches and laying the foundations of the stone camps that would become the cities of the future frontier. This petrification of the military presence was a signal to the tribes and to the world that the empire had reached its limit. The silence of the guard duty on the wall, staring out into the dark canopy of the unconquered forest, became the defining experience of the northern soldier. The horizon was no longer a destination to be reached, but a threat to be monitored. The myth of invincibility, which implies an irresistible forward momentum, was replaced by the reality of endurance, the capacity to stand still and resist the pressure of the barbarian world. The empire had ceased to be a growing organism and had become a fortress, locking itself in with its fears and its memories of the lost legions. The culmination of the punitive phase of the frontier wars occurred in the 16th year of the Common Era, on a plain near the Weser River known as Idis Diviso, where the Roman military machine attempted to exorcise the ghost of the forest defeat through a deliberate, set-piece confrontation with the coalition of tribes that had destroyed the 3 legions. The young commander, having spent 2 years ravaging the countryside and maneuvering his forces to provoke a decisive engagement, finally succeeded in drawing the tribal leader, the architect of the earlier ambush, into open battle. The logistical scale of this operation was immense, involving the coordination of 8 legions, thousands of auxiliary cavalry, and a riverine fleet used to transport supplies and troops deep into the interior, bypassing the treacherous overland routes that had doomed the previous governor. The preparation for the battle reflected a learned caution. The Romans did not enter the field blindly but secured their flanks, scouted the terrain, and deployed their forces to maximize the advantage of their superior discipline and equipment. The handling of this mutiny by the young commander, the nephew of the new emperor, serves as a case study in the management of institutional collapse through the redirection of violence. Confronted with thousands of armed men who refused to obey orders and who displayed the scars of their wounds as receipts for debt owed by the state, the commander was forced to resort to theatrical displays of loyalty and desperation, threatening suicide and distributing his own private funds to quell the uprising. The fragility of the imperial control was laid bare. The legions were revealed to be mercenaries in service to a dynasty only as long as the dynasty could guarantee their material survival. The resolution of the mutiny required the immediate manufacturing of an external crisis to reunify the fractured internal cohesion. The commander, understanding that idleness and reflection were the enemies of discipline, ordered a sudden and unprovoked invasion of the tribal lands across the river. This campaign was not motivated by strategic necessity or territorial acquisition, but by the psychological need to wash away the stain of sedition with the blood of the enemy. The legions, eager to redeem themselves and to secure plunder to supplement their grievances, crossed the frontier with a ferocity that was born of fear and guilt. The subsequent massacres of the unsuspecting tribal villages were not military engagements but acts of collective catharsis, a brutal reassertion of the power that the soldiers felt slipping from their grasp. The operational conduct of these post-mutiny campaigns revealed a shift in the tactical doctrine of the frontier armies, moving away from the confident, methodical expansionism of the earlier era toward a punitive, scorched-earth methodology designed to inflict maximum demographic damage rather than to assimilate the population. The legions moved through the forests not as colonizers, but as destroyers, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and enslaving the inhabitants of the valleys. The silence of the forest was broken by the systematic destruction of the tribal infrastructure, a deliberate attempt to create a buffer zone of desolation that would insulate the empire from future threats. The reports sent back to the capital by the commander described these actions in the language of necessary pacification, but the subtext was one of anxiety. The empire could no longer afford to occupy this land, it could only afford to ruin it. The realization that the northern territories were a trap, a place where Roman order dissolved into chaos, had taken root in the military consciousness. The soldiers who marched through the mud and the freezing rain were not fighting for the glory of expansion, but for the stabilization of their own morale and the suppression of the memory of the disaster that had occurred in those same woods years prior. The political fallout of the mutiny in the capital was a deepening of the paranoia that characterized the new emperor's reign. The realization that the frontier legions, the ultimate guarantors of the imperial power, were capable of independent political action and negotiation created a permanent rift between the military and the civil administration. The emperor, a man of cautious and cynical disposition, viewed the popularity of the young commander and the volatility of the troops with deep suspicion. The myth of the unified state, where the army, the senate, and the princeps moved in harmony, was exposed as a fiction maintained only by the distribution of silver. The silence of the Senate House during the reading of the reports from the Rhine was a silence of apprehension, as the senators understood that the true power of the state lay not in their decrees, but in the mood of the camps on the edge of the world. The management of the empire became a balancing act of appeasing the soldiers while preventing them from realizing the full extent of their power, a dynamic that would plague the history of the state for the next 4 centuries. The loss of the northern legions in the forest had not only halted the expansion, it had destabilized the foundation of the imperial peace, turning the army into a dangerous beast that had to be constantly fed and distracted lest it turn upon its masters. The strategic recalibration that followed the mutiny involved the construction of a permanent, static barrier along the river, a physical admission that the era of fluid borders was over. The construction of the limes, a network of watchtowers, forts, and palisades, consumed the labor of the legions, transforming them from a field army into a border guard. The soldiers traded their marching packs for shovels and trowels, digging the ditches and laying the foundations of the stone camps that would become the cities of the future frontier. This petrification of the military presence was a signal to the tribes and to the world that the empire had reached its limit. The silence of the guard duty on the wall, staring out into the dark canopy of the unconquered forest, became the defining experience of the northern soldier. The horizon was no longer a destination to be reached, but a threat to be monitored. The myth of invincibility, which implies an irresistible forward momentum, was replaced by the reality of endurance, the capacity to stand still and resist the pressure of the barbarian world. The empire had ceased to be a growing organism and had become a fortress, locking itself in with its fears and its memories of the lost legions. The culmination of the punitive phase of the frontier wars occurred in the 16th year of the Common Era, on a plain near the Weser River known as Idis Diviso, where the Roman military machine attempted to exorcise the ghost of the forest defeat through a deliberate, set-piece confrontation with the coalition of tribes that had destroyed the three legions. The young commander, having spent 2 years ravaging the countryside and maneuvering his forces to provoke a decisive engagement, finally succeeded in drawing the tribal leader, the architect of the earlier ambush, into open battle. The logistical scale of this operation was immense, involving the coordination of 8 legions, thousands of auxiliary cavalry, and a riverine fleet used to transport supplies and troops deep into the interior, bypassing the treacherous overland routes that had doomed the previous governor. The preparation for the battle reflected a learned caution. The Romans did not enter the field blindly but secured their flanks, scouted the terrain, and deployed their forces to maximize the advantage of their superior discipline and equipment. The economic consequences of this static defense were profound, creating a distinct frontier economy that operated independently of the agricultural cycles of the interior provinces. The concentration of tens of thousands of paid soldiers in a relatively unproductive strip of land necessitated the creation of a massive logistical tail that stretched back to the grain fields of Gaul and the manufactories of Italy. The forts acted as economic engines, drawing in resources and specie that stimulated the development of local markets and civilian settlements, or vici, which huddled against the stone walls of the military bases. These settlements, populated by the families of the soldiers, veterans, traders, and camp followers, represented a creeping Romanization of the borderlands, a cultural osmosis that occurred not through the sword but through the exchange of coin and goods. However, this economic vibrancy masked a strategic vulnerability. The legions, tethered to their stone bases and their dependent civilian populations, lost the strategic mobility that had once been their greatest asset. They became garrison troops, invested in the local soil, reluctant to march far from the homes and farms they had established. The myth of invincibility was eroded by domesticity, as the terrifying distance walker of the early republic was replaced by the border guard, whose primary concern was the collection of customs duties and the maintenance of the bathhouse. The strategic doctrine of the limes relied on the assumption of a fragmented enemy, a belief that the tribes beyond the river would remain in a state of perpetual disunity, incapable of mounting a coordinated assault on the fortified line. This assumption allowed the central administration to thin the density of the troops along the perimeter, relying on a system of rapid reaction forces and signaling towers to intercept small raiding parties. The intelligence-gathering apparatus, which had failed so catastrophically in the forest, was reorganized to focus on the diplomatic manipulation of the client states that served as buffers between the empire and the chaotic interior. The flow of subsidies, gold, silver, and weapons across the border was intended to purchase loyalty and incite internecine conflict among the tribes, outsourcing the violence to the barbarians themselves. This policy of divide and rule maintained the peace for decades, but it also fostered a dependency on the very populations that the empire sought to contain. The silence of the frontier was a purchased silence, maintained by the regular arrival of the tribute wagons and the careful management of tribal egos by the provincial governors. The realization that the security of the empire rested not on the strength of the legions, but on the fragility of these diplomatic arrangements, introduced a chronic anxiety into the strategic calculus of the high command. The psychological transformation of the legionary during this period of stasis was marked by a gradual erosion of the offensive spirit that had defined the ethos of the army since the Punic Wars. The training drills continued, the discipline remained harsh, but the ultimate purpose of the violence had shifted from conquest to preservation. The soldier stood on the ramparts, looking out at the forest that his ancestors had marched through, and understood that he was forbidden to enter them. The prohibition on expansion created a cognitive dissonance within an institution that was built on the ideology of imperium sine fine, empire without end. The invincibility of the legion became a defensive concept, the ability to hold the line rather than the ability to advance it. The adoption of heavier defensive armor and the increasing reliance on missile weapons and artillery within the forts reflected this shift, prioritizing the survival of the unit over the destruction of the enemy in open battle. The silence of the long watch, traversing the same patrol paths year after year, bred a sense of complacency and a dangerous familiarity with the enemy across the river, who were no longer mysterious savages but trading partners and neighbors. The integration of the frontier zones into the provincial structure also meant that the legions became key players in the political economy of the region, engaging in construction projects, road building, and law enforcement that had little to do with warfare. The soldier administrator became a common figure, a man who spent more time adjudicating disputes or supervising mines than wielding a gladius. This diversification of roles diluted the martial focus of the units, creating a hybrid institution that was part military machine, part bureaucracy. The corruption that inevitably followed the flow of money and power into the frontier zones further weakened the integrity of the legions. The sale of exemptions from duty, the embezzlement of supplies, and the exploitation of the local population became endemic problems that the central government struggled to control from the distant capital. The silence of the audit rooms, where the scribes tallied the missing grain and the ghost soldiers on the payroll, was the sound of an institution slowly rotting from within, its outer shell of stone hiding a hollow core of administrative decay. The invincibility of the legion was compromised not by a stronger enemy, but by the slow, grinding friction of peace and the corrosive effect of stationary existence on a force designed for motion. The illusion of stability along the northern frontier was shattered in the 69th year of the Common Era, a period of internal collapse known in the historical record as the Year of the Four Emperors, which demonstrated that the greatest threat to the integrity of the legions was not the barbarian at the gate, but the ambition of the generals within the walls. The withdrawal of the elite manpower from the Rhine frontier to fight in the civil wars of succession left the border dangerously denuded, a strategic vacuum that was immediately recognized and exploited by the indigenous auxiliary units. These cohorts, recruited from the local river island tribes and trained in Roman tactics and discipline, had served as the eyes and ears of the legions for decades. Their leader, a charismatic chieftain who held Roman citizenship and equestrian rank, initiated a rebellion that was not a chaotic tribal uprising, but a calculated military coup designed to establish an independent Gallic empire. The revolt began under the guise of supporting one of the claimants to the imperial throne, a deception that paralyzed the remaining loyalist forces and allowed the rebels to consolidate their power base before their true intentions were revealed. The siege of the great double legionary fortress at Castra Vetera stands as the definitive moment when the myth of invincibility was irrevocably broken in the eyes of the northern populations. The fortress, a massive complex of stone and timber situated on a high bluff overlooking the river, was garrisoned by the remnants of 2 legions, understrength and demoralized by the political chaos in the capital. The besieging force, composed of Batavian auxiliaries and their Germanic allies, did not employ the primitive tactics of the forest ambush, but utilized the very siege engines and engineering techniques they had learned from their Roman masters. They constructed ramparts, diverted the river to flood the defenses, and subjected the fortress to a relentless bombardment. The silence of the siege was a terrifying inversion of the natural order. The barbarians were not hiding in the woods, but standing in the open, operating catapults and maintaining a blockade with professional efficiency. The Roman defenders, trapped within their own walls, found themselves outmatched not in courage, but in the application of their own military science. The realization that the monopoly on organized violence had been lost, that the secrets of the empire had been absorbed and weaponized by the subject peoples, struck a fatal blow to the psychological superiority of the legionary. The disintegration of the morale within the besieged fortress was accelerated by the starvation and the knowledge that no relief army was coming from the south, where the legions were slaughtering each other for control of the Palatine. The surrender of the fortress, when it finally came, was a spectacle of humiliation that resonated across the entire frontier. The Roman commanders, men of senatorial and equestrian rank, were forced to swear allegiance to the Gallic Empire, a political entity that explicitly rejected the sovereignty of Rome. The surviving legionaries were marched out of the gates, not with the honors of war but as captives, stripped of their arms and standards. The subsequent massacre of the prisoners by the Germanic allies of the rebels, despite the promises of safe conduct, was a brutal reminder of the hatred that had festered during the years of occupation. The destruction of the fortress, burned to the ground so that not one stone was left upon another, was a symbolic erasure of the Roman presence, a declaration that the stone line could be broken and the legions could be made to kneel. The revolt spread like a contagion along the river, as other auxiliary units defected and the Gallic tribes, sensing the weakness of the central authority, joined the uprising. The entire defensive system of the Rhine collapsed, not because of an overwhelming external invasion, but because the internal components of the security architecture turned against the structure. The invincibility of the system was predicated on the loyalty of the non-Roman elements that constituted half of the military strength. Once that loyalty was fractured, the legions were numerically and tactically insufficient to hold the line. The silence of the smoking ruins of the frontier forts was a testament to the failure of the assimilation policy. The empire had trained its own executioners, equipping them with the skills and the weapons to dismantle the Pax Romana. The news of the disaster reached the capital in the midst of the civil war, adding a layer of existential dread to the political crisis. The prophecy of the empire's end, often whispered in the temples, seemed to be manifesting in the north. The suppression of the revolt required the dispatch of a massive expeditionary force, numbering 8 legions, once the political situation in Rome had stabilized under a new dynasty. The campaign to retake the frontier was brutal and methodical, a reassertion of dominance through overwhelming force. However, the nature of the victory was different from the conquests of the past. The legions fought not against a disorganized rabble, but against an enemy that fought like Romans, maintaining formation and using terrain with sophistication. The final defeat of the rebel leader was achieved not through a decisive annihilation, but through a negotiated settlement, a recognition that the cost of total victory was too high. The rebel leader was not paraded in chains through the forum. He vanished into the mists of history, likely reinstated to a position of command to ensure the pacification of his people. The silence of the restored frontier was an uneasy silence, built on compromise and the grim understanding that the empire could essentially be held hostage by its own auxiliary forces. The legacy of the Civilist Revolt was a fundamental reorganization of the auxiliary system. The policy of allowing ethnic units to serve under their own chieftains in their own homelands was abandoned. Henceforth, auxiliaries would be recruited in one part of the empire and deployed to the other side of the world, severing the link between the soldier and the local soil. A Batavian would serve in Britain, a Briton in Dacia. This displacement policy was an administrative admission of fear, a structural acknowledgement that trust was no longer a viable currency in the management of the army. The myth of invincibility had been replaced by the mechanics of surveillance and dislocation. The legions rebuilt their stone camps, but the psychological walls had been breached. They knew, and the world knew, that the Roman eagle could be brought down, captured, and caged by the very people it was meant to rule. The silence of the river watch resumed, but it was now the watchful silence of a jailer who knows that the prisoners possess the keys to the cells. The border had held, but the illusion of eternal dominance had been washed away by the waters of the Rhine and the blood of the Civil War. The systemic resilience of the imperial military machine was subjected to a stress test of unprecedented magnitude in the middle decades of the 2nd century, a crisis that originated not from the steel of a barbarian adversary but from the invisible, microbial geography of the East. The legions, returning from a victorious campaign against the Parthian Empire, carried with them a biological payload that would dismantle the demographic foundations of the state more effectively than any defeat in the field. The Antonine Plague, as it came to be known in the historical record, utilized the very efficiency of the Roman logistical network, the paved roads, the grain ships, and the marching columns, to disseminate a pathogen, likely smallpox, into the heart of the military camps along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The silence that fell over the fortress towns was the silence of the hospital and the pyre. Entire cohorts were rendered combat ineffective not by desertion or mutiny, but by a mortality rate that depopulated the barracks and left the watchtowers unmanned. The administrative response to this biological siege was a desperate scramble for manpower that violated the traditional recruitment protocols of the legions. The emperor, a philosopher king known for his stoic adherence to duty, was forced to recruit slaves, gladiators, and bandits into the ranks, diluting the professional quality of the army with untrained and socially marginalized elements. The realization that the legions were biological entities, vulnerable to the same natural laws of disease and decay as the meanest peasant, stripped away the aura of supernatural endurance that had surrounded the eagles. The army was no longer an inexhaustible reservoir of force. It was a fragile organism, bleeding manpower into the mass graves that now ringed the frontier posts. This moment of biological weakness coincided with a massive, coordinated migration of tribal confederations across the Danube, a geopolitical shift driven by pressures deep within the Eurasian steppe that forced the Germanic peoples, the Marcomanni and the Quadi, against the Roman perimeter. The Great Breach of the year 166 marked the first time in centuries that the northern barbarians successfully penetrated the defensive shell of the empire and reached the Italian peninsula itself. The siege of the city of Aquileia, a wealthy commercial hub located at the head of the Adriatic, sent a shockwave of terror through the Roman populace that had not been felt since the days of Hannibal. The silence of the Italian countryside, usually immune to the ravages of war, was broken by the smoke of burning villas and the tramp of barbarian feet. The legions, decimated by the plague and stretched thin along the river, were unable to intercept the invasion at the border. The myth of the limes as an impermeable barrier was shattered. The stone walls and the river fleets were revealed to be insufficient without the living bodies of the soldiers to man them. The realization that the heartland of the empire was vulnerable, that the legions could fail to protect the sacred soil of Italy, fundamentally altered the psychological contract between the citizen and the state. The security of Rome was no longer a guaranteed fact of nature, but a precarious condition that had to be bought with extraordinary sacrifices. The fiscal crisis precipitated by these simultaneous wars and the plague forced the state to cannibalize its own wealth to sustain the military effort. The emperor conducted a public auction of the imperial palace's treasures, golden goblets, silken robes, and precious gems, in the Forum of Trajan to raise the funds necessary to pay the troops and purchase supplies. This spectacle of liquidation, where the symbols of imperial majesty were sold to the highest bidder to finance the defense of the realm, was a visual admission of the state's exhaustion. The economic invincibility of Rome, the ability to outspend any opponent, was proving to be finite. The legions were fighting a war of attrition on the frozen banks of the Danube that consumed the accumulated capital of the Golden Age. The silence of the empty treasury vaults echoed the silence of the plague-stricken villages. The soldiers on the front lines, shivering in the winter cold, understood that the empire was bleeding out, that the supply trains were growing thinner, and that the reinforcements were mere shadows of the men who had marched before. The victory, when it was eventually achieved after decades of grinding conflict, was a grim, defensive victory. The tribes were pushed back, but the confidence of the offensive was gone. The empire settled into a long, weary vigil, knowing that the pressure on the borders would never cease and that the strength of the legions was a wasting asset. The cultural impact of the Marcomannic Wars was the introduction of a deep melancholy into the Roman worldview, a sense that the world was growing old and that the Golden Age had passed. The monumental column erected in the Capitol to commemorate the campaigns depicts the violence of the frontier with a brutal realism. Scenes of execution, deportation, and village burning replaced the heroic, idealized combat of earlier monuments. The faces of the soldiers are etched with fatigue and grim determination, not triumph. The silence of the stone reliefs speaks of the cost of the border, the endless cycle of violence required to maintain the stasis of the empire. The integration of thousands of defeated barbarians into the empire as laity, settler soldiers granted land in exchange for military service, further transformed the character of the legions. The army that defended the empire was increasingly composed of the very people it was fighting against, a barbarization of the ranks that blurred the distinction between the Roman and the other. The discipline and the drill remained, but the cultural homogeneity of the legion was lost. The silence of the camp was now filled with the guttural dialects of the Germanic tribesmen who wore the larica segmentata, serving a state that they viewed not as a divine idea, but as a source of steady pay and arable land. The definitive shattering of the imperial dignity and the collapse of the illusion that the emperor, and by extension the state, was untouchable occurred in the middle of the 3rd century, during a disastrous campaign in the east that exposed the limits of Roman power against a peer competitor. The Sassanid Empire of Persia, a resurgent and centralized power that claimed the legacy of the ancient Achaemenids, presented a strategic challenge that the fragmented and politically unstable Roman state was ill-equipped to handle. In the year 260, the Roman Emperor Valerian, attempting to halt the Persian advance into Syria, led a massive army into Mesopotamia. The logistical failures and the ravages of a new plague weakened the legions before they could engage the enemy. The confrontation near the city of Edessa did not result in a heroic last stand, but in a shameful negotiation that turned into a trap. The emperor, seeking a diplomatic solution to save his starving army, rode out to meet the Persian king of kings and was seized, along with his entire general staff. The silence of the Roman army as they watched their sovereign, the living embodiment of the state, being dragged away in chains was the silence of total cognitive collapse. The legions, leaderless and surrendered en masse, destined for a life of slavery, building dams and bridges for the Persian monarch. The image of the Roman emperor serving as a footstool for the Persian king, and later his skin being flayed and stuffed with straw as a trophy in a Persian temple, circulated throughout the ancient world, destroying the prestige of Rome in the eyes of its subjects and its enemies. The realization that the Augustus could be captured and enslaved like a common criminal broke the spell of imperial divinity. If the head of the state could be humiliated, then the state itself was mortal. The legions, which had sworn their oaths to this man, found themselves paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. The central authority of Rome evaporated. The provinces, realizing that the center could no longer protect them or even protect itself, began to fracture into autonomous political entities. The crisis of the 3rd century was not just a period of civil war. It was the dissolution of the unified command structure that had made the legions invincible. The armies of the Rhine and the Danube, feeling abandoned, declared their own generals to be emperors, creating the Gallic Empire in the west. The wealthy cities of the east rallied behind the Queen of Palmyra, creating a separate empire in the Levant. The silence of the Roman Senate was the silence of irrelevance. The power had moved to the frontiers, and the frontiers were at war with each other. The transformation of the legions during this period of anarchy was profound. The grand, maneuvering armies of the early empire, designed for conquest, devolved into regional militias and mobile field armies, the comitatenses, designed for rapid response to breakthroughs and internal rebellions. The loyalty of the soldier was no longer to the abstract concept of Roma or the Senate and people, but to his immediate commander, the man who provided the donative gold and the food. The army became a mechanism for the extraction of resources from the civilian population, a predator within the state. The soldiers, unpaid and unsupplied by the central bureaucracy, took what they needed from the cities they were garrisoned in. The silence of the provincial towns as the legions approached was a silence of fear. The defenders of the state had become indistinguishable from the bandits and the barbarians they were supposed to fight. The realization that the military was a separate caste, ruling over the empire rather than serving it, fundamentally altered the social fabric of the Roman world. The reliance on heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, copied from the Persian, and the Sassanid enemies, marked a shift in tactical doctrine that acknowledged the obsolescence of the traditional infantry-centric legion. The Romans were forced to adapt to the superior mobility and shock power of their eastern adversaries. The silence of the infantry square was replaced by the thunder of the armored horsemen. The legionary, once the master of the battlefield, became a supporting element, a holder of ground while the cavalry delivered the decisive blow. This technological and tactical evolution was a survival mechanism, but it was also an admission that the old Roman way of war was no longer sufficient. The invincibility was gone. What remained was a desperate, fluid struggle for survival in a world where Rome was just one of many powers, and often not the strongest one. The psychological landscape of the soldier in the 3rd century was defined by the worship of new, personal gods. Mithras, Sol Invictus, deities that promised personal salvation and victory over death, reflecting the insecurity of the age. The state religion, the cult of the emperor, rang hollow when emperors were being assassinated by their own guards or captured by foreigners every few years. The soldiers sought protection in mystery cults that offered a brotherhood and a sense of meaning that the crumbling state could not. The silence of the Mithraeum, the underground temple where soldiers gathered in darkness to share the blood of the bull, was a silence of private devotion, separated from the public rites of the failing empire. The cohesion of the legion was maintained by these secret societies and the bond of shared hardship, rather than by the eagle standard or the image of the distant, transient emperor. The restoration of order, when it finally came under the Illyrian emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, was achieved not by a return to the old republic, but by the imposition of a naked military dictatorship. The empire was saved, but it was a different empire, a dominate, where the emperor was a god-king ruling through coercion and a massive, expanded bureaucracy. The legions were reorganized, broken into smaller units to prevent rebellion, and stationed in depth to catch raiders. The myth of invincibility was never restored. It was replaced by the reality of a fortress state, constantly mobilized, constantly taxing, and constantly fighting to hold back the tide of history. The silence of the Roman world at the end of the 3rd century was the silence of a prison, where order was maintained by the sword and the spy, and where the memory of the lost legions of the Teutoburg forest and the captured emperor in Persia served as constant reminders of the fragility of power. The legions had survived, but they had lost their soul. They were no longer the conquerors of the world, but the jailers of a besieged civilization. The structural integrity of the late imperial military apparatus, having been reorganized and hardened by the reforms of the Tetrarchy to prioritize depth of defense and the mobility of the comitatus, faced its ultimate existential crisis in the latter half of the 4th century, a period defined by a demographic and kinetic energy that originated on the steppes of Central Asia and transmitted its shockwaves to the banks of the Danube. The arrival of the Huns, a nomadic confederation whose tactical reliance on the mounted archer and whose strategic speed defied the comprehension of the Germanic tribes, initiated a domino effect of displacement that forced the Tervingi and Greuthungi Goths against the Roman frontier not as an invading army, but as a desperate refugee population seeking sanctuary within the limes. The administrative failure of the Roman officials on the Danube to manage this migration, characterized by the exploitation of the starving refugees and the violation of diplomatic protocols, transformed a humanitarian crisis into a military insurrection within the borders of the empire. The resulting conflict culminated on the 9th day of August in the year 378, on a burning plain outside the city of Adrianople, a battle that would be recorded by contemporary historians as the day the sun set permanently on the classic Roman infantry tradition. The Eastern Emperor Valens, seeking to claim the glory of pacification before the arrival of his Western colleague, committed the field army of the East to a decisive engagement without adequate reconnaissance or water supply, marching his heavy infantry over difficult terrain in the height of the summer heat to attack a Gothic laager that was essentially a fortified wagon circle. The engagement at Adrianople revealed the catastrophic obsolescence of the legionary formation when deprived of its logistical support and flank protection in the face of heavy cavalry. The Roman infantry, exhausted by the march and the thirst, were pinned against the wagon circle by the Gothic infantry, unable to maneuver or deploy their lines effectively. The arrival of the Gothic cavalry, which had been foraging away from the main body, struck the Roman flank like a thunderbolt, rolling up the line and compressing the legions into a chaotic mass where individual soldiers were so tightly packed they could not raise their arms to strike or draw their swords. The silence of the Roman discipline, usually the guarantor of victory, was drowned out by the screams of men being crushed by the weight of their own armor and the bodies of their comrades. The slaughter that ensued resulted in the destruction of 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army, the death of 35 tribunes, and the death of the emperor himself, whose body was never recovered, lost in the anonymity of the pile or burned in a peasant's cottage where he had sought refuge. The loss at Adrianople was not merely a defeat, it was a decapitation of the state and a demystification of the legion. The realization that a barbarian force could annihilate the flower of the imperial army on open ground destroyed the psychological barrier that had held the tribes in check. The Goths roamed the Balkans at will, not as raiders, but as an independent power bloc within the empire, proving that the legions were no longer the masters of the landscape. The strategic response to the disaster at Adrianople by the new Emperor Theodosius involved a fundamental alteration in the composition of the military that effectively ended the existence of the Roman legion as a citizen-based institution. Faced with the impossibility of recruiting and training enough Roman citizens to replace the losses in time to save the state, the administration turned to the very barbarians who had defeated them. The policy of foederati was expanded to an industrial scale. Entire Gothic tribes were settled on imperial land and paid from the imperial treasury to fight under their own chieftains using their own weapons and tactics. The Roman army ceased to be a homogenizing force of Latinization and discipline and became a polyglot collection of mercenary warbands held together by gold and the promise of land. The silence of the drill field, where the centurion had once taught the recruit the precise mechanics of the gladius, was replaced by the noise of the Gothic camp, where loyalty was personal to the warlord rather than abstract to the state. The Roman soldier of the 5th century was likely a Vandal, a Frank, or an Allan, wearing trousers and wielding a long sword, indistinguishable from the enemies he was fighting except for the badge on his shield. The myth of the legion was hollowed out from the inside. The shell remained, but the biological and cultural organism that had conquered the Mediterranean was extinct. The final disintegration of the western frontier was not a military event, but a climatological and hydrological accident that rendered the fortifications of the Rhine useless. On the last day of the year 406, the river, which had served as the physical and psychological barrier of the West for 400 years, froze solid. The natural moat of the empire became a bridge of ice. A massive coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi walked across the frozen surface, bypassing the forts and the river fleets that were locked in the ice. The legions, denuded of manpower to defend Italy against the Visigoths, were non-existent or powerless to stop the inundation. The invaders swept into Gaul, not as a raiding party, but as a migration of nations, sacking cities that had known the Pax Romana for centuries. The silence of the Gallic provinces was shattered by the collapse of the civil administration. The tax collectors fled, the courts closed, and the roads became arteries of flight. The realization that the empire could no longer protect its subjects dissolved the social contract that bound the provincial aristocracy to Rome. The local elites began to make their own accommodations with the barbarian warlords, recognizing that the legions were a memory and that the future belonged to the men who could command the loyalty of the warbands. The defense-in-depth strategy had failed because there was no depth left. The center had consumed the periphery to save itself, and now the periphery was gone. The abandonment of the province of Britannia in the year 410 served as a microcosm of the imperial retreat, a bureaucratic deletion of an entire territory from the map of the state. The rescript of the Emperor Honorius, telling the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses, was a formal admission of impotence. The legions that had built Hadrian's Wall and garrisoned the fortresses of York and Chester were withdrawn to fight in the civil wars of the continent or to protect the person of the emperor in Ravenna. The silence that fell over the stone barracks of Britain was the silence of a permanent departure. The coins ceased to circulate, the pottery kilns stopped firing, and the villas were reclaimed by the earth. The inhabitants, Romanized Britons who spoke Latin and wore togas, were left alone to face the Saxons and the Picts, watching the horizon for sails that would never return. The myth of Rome as an eternal protector was revealed to be a logistical calculation. When the cost of defense exceeded the value of the tax revenue, the province was discarded. The silence of the abandoned wall was the physical manifestation of the empire's shrinking shadow, a retraction of power that left a vacuum where civilization had once stood. The psychological terminus of the myth of invincibility arrived on the 24th day of August in the year 410, when the Visigothic king Alaric, a former commander of Roman auxiliary troops who had been denied a generalship and land for his people, led his army to the gates of Rome itself. The city, the Caput Mundi, the head of the world, which had not seen a foreign enemy within its walls for 800 years, was besieged not by a distant invader, but by a force that had been nurtured within the empire's own borders. The siege was broken not by assault but by treachery. The Salarian gate was opened from the inside, and the Goths poured into the streets. The sack of Rome was a restrained affair by the standards of ancient warfare. Alaric ordered that churches be respected and that there be no general massacre, but the symbolic violence was absolute. The silence of the Forum Romanum, the center of the political universe, was violated by the boots of the barbarians. The looting of the mausoleums of the emperors and the burning of the Senate house were acts of desecration that signaled the end of an epoch. The news of the sack reverberated across the Mediterranean with the force of a theological apocalypse. Saint Jerome, writing from his cell in Bethlehem, recorded his shock in words that defined the trauma of the age. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The psychological invincibility of Rome was based on its sanctity, its destiny as the eternal city. The violation of this sanctity proved that history had returned to the West, that the divine protection had been lifted, and that the empire was just another state subject to the laws of decay. The refugees fleeing the city carried the story of the fall to Africa and the East, spreading the realization that the center was hollow. The legions, scattered and unpaid, had failed to save the mother of the empire. The Emperor Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, was reported to have been more concerned about the welfare of his pet chicken named Roma than the city of the same name, an anecdote that, whether true or not, encapsulated the detachment and irrelevance of the central authority. The final decades of the Western Empire were a twilight period where the forms of the legion persisted, but the substance was entirely transformed. The Roman armies were commanded by Germanic generals, Stilicho Aetius Ricimer, who held the title of Magister Militum and wielded the real power behind the throne of child emperors. These men fought brilliant campaigns, defeating the Huns at the Catalonian plains, but they fought using armies that were essentially barbarian coalitions. The victory over Attila was not a victory of the legion over the horde, but a victory of the Visigoths and Franks fighting for their new lands against the Huns, with the Roman general acting as the coordinator. The silence of the Roman officer corps was the silence of obsolescence. They had been replaced by the warrior aristocracy of the migration period. The legion was now a term of art, a label applied to a motley collection of bucellarii, private household troops, and federate warbands. The economic infrastructure that supported the professional standing army, the taxation of the agricultural surplus, the state factories for arms and armor, the intricate logistical network of roads and granaries, collapsed as the provinces were detached from the central administration. The Vandals seized North Africa, the grain basket of the West, cutting the jugular vein of the imperial economy. Without grain, the state could not feed the city of Rome or pay the army. The legions dissolved because the state could no longer feed them. The soldiers deserted to their farms or joined the local warlords who could provide protection and plunder. The silence of the great military roads, once thundering with the march of the cohorts, was the silence of economic fragmentation. The empire broke down into localized microcosms of power, prefiguring the feudal system of the Middle Ages. The formal end of the Western military structure came in the year 476, a date that is often cited as the fall of the empire but was in reality a bureaucratic formality. The barbarian general Odoacer, commanding the Roman army in Italy, which consisted almost entirely of Heruli, Syrian and Ruggian mercenaries, demanded land in Italy for his troops, exactly as the veterans of the old legions had demanded land after their service. When the demand was refused by the regent Orestes, Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. There was no great battle, no last stand of the Praetorian Guard. Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, stating that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. The legions did not die on a field of glory, they were simply demobilized and transformed into the landowning aristocracy of the new Germanic kingdom. The silence of the last Roman barracks was the silence of a lease expiring. The eagle standards were melted down or hidden, and the gladius was exchanged for the spada. The myth of invincibility had been dead for generations before the final political collapse. It died in the Teutoburg forest, was buried at Adrianople, and was forgotten in the sack of Rome. The transition was a slow, agonizing process of learning that the world was larger and more chaotic than the grid of the Roman camp could contain. The realization that the legions were mortal was the birth of the modern world, a world of multiple powers, shifting borders, and the constant struggle for survival without the guarantee of a universal order. The silence that settled over the ruins of the Roman West was not an empty silence, but a silence pregnant with the beginnings of Europe. The stones of the forts were taken to build the castles of the kings and the churches of the bishops. The discipline of the legion was lost, but the memory of the order it once imposed remained, a phantom limb that would haunt the imagination of the West for 1,000 years. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.